The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered fence posts of the Morrison Ranch, where Jake Morrison stood with calloused hands gripping a crumpled bank notice. The paper trembled slightly in the October wind, its formal language spelling out the end of everything his father and grandfather had built. 30 days to pay $1,800, or lose the land that had been Morrison territory for 3 generations. He folded the notice carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. Next to the 2 silver dollars that represented his entire fortune, the cattle lowed softly in the distance, unaware that their home hung in the balance. Inside the small ranch house, Jake sat at his father's oak desk, surrounded by ledger books filled with his clumsy handwriting and mounting debts. The numbers swam before his tired eyes: feed costs, veterinary bills, loan payments that had grown beyond his ability to track properly. His father had handled the business side with natural ease, but Jake had always been better with horses than with figures. The lamp flickered as he pushed the books away in frustration, knowing that no amount of studying would create money he didn't have. Through the window, the first frost sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds, beautiful and unforgiving. At the Cedar Creek General Store, Jake stood before the community bulletin board, reading advertisements for farmhands and livestock auctions with desperate attention. Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife, watched him with sympathetic eyes as he counted his coins for the 3rd time. "Hard times, Jake," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of shared community struggles. He nodded, unable to trust his voice, when a bright yellow handbill caught his eye. "County Fair, Cedar Creek, Special Bride Auction, November 1st, find your perfect companion." The words seemed to blur together as hope and desperation warred in his chest. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Jake's world tilted on its axis as he read the handbill again, realizing that a mail-order bride auction might be his only chance at salvation. A wife could bring resources, connections, perhaps even money, to help save the ranch and provide the companionship his lonely heart secretly craved. The idea felt both desperate and somehow inevitable, as if fate had placed this opportunity directly in his path. He tore the handbill from the board with shaking hands, ignoring Mrs. Patterson's surprised expression. The county fair was tomorrow, and his $2 might just be enough to change everything. That evening, Jake sat on his front porch as darkness settled over the valley. The handbill spread on his knee like a map to an unknown country. The stars emerged one by one above the familiar peaks. The same stars his father had pointed out during long summer nights filled with stories and dreams. Now, those dreams seemed as distant as the constellations. Yet the possibility of tomorrow sparked something he hadn't felt in months. He thought about the women who might attend such an auction, desperate souls like himself, perhaps seeking escape from their own impossible circumstances. The wind carried the scent of pine and the promise of winter, while his heart carried the fragile hope of redemption. As dawn broke over the ranch, Jake stood in his bedroom holding his father's best shirt and the black suit reserved for church and funerals. The mirror reflected a man aged beyond his 32 years, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much loss too early. He shaved carefully with his father's straight razor, each stroke a small act of faith in an uncertain future. The 2 silver dollars clinked softly in his pocket as he adjusted his tie, their weight both insignificant and enormous. Today he would gamble everything on a stranger, trusting that Providence would guide his desperate choice toward salvation rather than further ruin. The Cedar Creek County Fair bustled with autumn energy, children running between booths selling apple cider and hand-carved toys, while farmers displayed their finest livestock and harvest goods. Jake walked through the crowd feeling like an outsider in his own community, his stomach tight with nervous energy and his hand constantly checking for his 2 precious coins. The smell of roasted corn and wood smoke filled the air, normally comforting scents that today seemed to mock his desperate circumstances. Near the main tent, a small crowd gathered around a makeshift platform where the auction would take place, and Jake's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. He approached slowly, knowing that once he committed to this path, there would be no turning back to his solitary life. Standing before the auction platform, Jake watched 5 veiled women arrange themselves in a nervous line, their faces hidden, but their posture speaking volumes about their own desperation and hope. The auctioneer called for the bidding to begin. and Jake's hand trembled as he raised it with his meager offer of $2 for the woman at the end of the line. Something about her straight shoulders and graceful bearing called to him across the impossible distance. Other bidders laughed at his paltry sum, but when the hammer fell in his favor due to lack of competing interest, Jake knew he had made the most important choice of his life. The woman turned toward him, her dark eyes visible above a simple brown veil, and he saw intelligence and determination that matched his own desperate courage. In that moment, Jake Morrison chose to trust in love before logic, hope before security. Sarah Beth Williams lifted her veil with steady hands, revealing a face that defied every expectation Jake had harbored about desperate women at bride auctions. Her features held the refined beauty of education and privilege, high cheekbones, intelligent brown eyes, and skin that spoke of indoor comfort rather than frontier hardship. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 25, with dark hair arranged in a practical but elegant style that suggested both determination and grace. "Mr. Morrison, I presume," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern education mixed with something warmer, more genuine. Jake nodded, suddenly aware of his own rough appearance and uncertain how this poised woman had ended up in his unlikely sphere. As they walked away from the fairground together, Sarah Beth's small traveling bag in Jake's hand, she spoke quietly about her circumstances with a directness that both surprised and impressed him. "I should tell you, Mr. Morrison, that I'm not what most people would consider typical bride auction material," she began, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of their shared gamble. She had fled Denver 3 days ago, she explained, escaping an arranged marriage to a man her banker father had chosen for business rather than love. Jake listened with growing amazement as she described her education in accounting and business management, skills that seemed like answered prayers to his desperate situation. The autumn air carried their words toward an uncertain future, while both wondered if they had found salvation or simply different forms of the same trap. By evening, Jake and Sarah Beth sat across from each other at his small kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and preserved venison, while carefully negotiating the terms of their unexpected partnership. She had examined his ledger books with professional competence, her educated eye quickly identifying the chaos that had contributed to his financial crisis. "Your bookkeeping needs work, but the ranch itself is fundamentally sound," she said, her fingers tracing columns of numbers with surprising confidence. Jake watched her animated face as she spoke about profit margins and debt restructuring, marveling at how different this conversation was from any he had imagined having with a mail order bride. The lamplight flickered between them, illuminating not just their faces but the possibility that two desperate people might indeed save each other. That night, Sarah Beth settled into the small spare room that had once belonged to Jake's sister, while he lay wakeful in his father's bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving through his house. The walls seemed to hold their breath around this new arrangement, as if the ranch itself was adjusting to the presence of feminine intelligence and determination. Through the thin walls, he could hear her moving about quietly, organizing her few possessions and perhaps contemplating the magnitude of the choice they had both made. Tomorrow would bring the real test of their partnership, when Sarah Beth would have to prove that her confidence in fixing his financial problems was more than educated optimism. The wind rattled the windows gently, a lullaby for two strangers who had gambled everything on the possibility of finding home in each other. Dawn brought Sarah Beth to the kitchen before Jake woke, where she had coffee brewing and eggs frying with the competence of someone accustomed to taking care of herself. She wore a practical brown dress that managed to look both sensible and attractive, her hair arranged in a working style that suggested she meant business. Jake emerged from his room to find her examining his account books, spread across the table, her breakfast growing cold as she made notes in precise handwriting. "Good morning, husband," she said with a slight smile that acknowledged the strangeness of their situation, while establishing the roles they had chosen to play. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge they were both still learning to cross. Over the next several days, Jake watched in amazement as Sarah Beth transformed his chaotic record-keeping into organized systems that revealed exactly where his money had been disappearing. She worked with focused intensity, her pen scratching across pages as she separated essential expenses from wasteful ones, identified debts that could be negotiated, and created payment schedules that actually made sense. Jake found himself looking forward to their evening discussions about ranch business. her educated perspective opening his eyes to possibilities he had never considered. She spoke with growing animation about breeding programs, market timing, and cost reduction strategies that demonstrated not just book learning but genuine insight into agricultural economics. The house felt alive with purpose and intelligence for the first time since his father's death. Sarah Beth proved equally capable when it came to the physical demands of ranch life. Though Jake suspected she was learning as she went and simply refused to admit defeat, she helped with the morning milking, her city hands quickly developing the rhythm and strength needed for the work. And she approached every task with the same methodical competence she brought to the account books. When Jake expressed amazement at her adaptability, she smiled with quiet pride and said, "My father always believed that intelligence without practical application was worthless. I suppose I learned more from him than either of us realized." Her words carried both affection and pain, revealing the complex feelings she harbored toward the family she had left behind. Jake began to understand that Sarah Beth's flight from Denver represented not just escape, but the courage to choose her own definition of success. In the quiet moments between work, Jake found himself stealing glances at Sarah Beth as she moved through tasks with graceful efficiency, wondering how a woman of her obvious refinement had ended up desperate enough to flee to a bride auction. She caught him watching one afternoon and met his gaze directly, her brown eyes holding depths he was only beginning to understand. "You're wondering about my story," she said simply, setting down the account ledger and folding her hands in her lap with characteristic composure. Jake nodded, and she began to speak about her life in Denver with a mixture of fondness and frustration that painted a picture of gilded captivity among people who valued her intelligence only when it served their purposes. Her father's bank, she explained, dealt in ranch mortgages and agricultural loans, knowledge that was now serving Jake's desperate situation in ways neither of them could have predicted. As October faded toward November, Jake and Sarah Beth developed a comfortable rhythm of shared work and evening conversations that felt increasingly natural, despite their unconventional beginning. She would sit by the fire with her mending, while he repaired tack and equipment, their talk flowing easily between ranch business and more personal revelations. Jake learned that she had taught herself to read financial statements by studying her father's business papers, and she discovered that his apparent simplicity masked a deep understanding of land, animals, and the subtle rhythms of agricultural life. The house grew warmer not just from the increasing use of the fireplace, but from the presence of two people learning to trust each other with their vulnerabilities and dreams. Neither spoke directly of growing affection, but it showed in small gestures. Sarah Beth's extra care with Jake's favorite meals, his attention to chopping enough wood to keep her comfortable through the cold nights. One evening, as the first snow began to fall outside the kitchen window, Sarah Beth looked up from the financial reports she had been studying and said quietly, "Jake, I need you to know that I'm not here just because I had nowhere else to go." Her voice carried a vulnerability he had never heard before, and Jake set down his coffee cup to give her his complete attention. She spoke about watching him work with the horses, seeing his patient gentleness with injured animals, and recognizing in him the kind of authentic goodness that had been missing from every man her father had deemed suitable for marriage. "I chose you," she said simply, "just as much as you chose me, even if neither of us fully understood what we were doing at the time." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth, and everything to do with the realization that what had begun as desperation was transforming into something much deeper and more precious. The morning brought disturbing news in the form of Tom Bradley, the bank representative, riding up to the ranch house with papers clutched in his gloved hand and a grim expression that spoke of unwelcome business. Jake and Sarah Beth met him on the front porch, presenting a united front despite the anxiety that knotted Jake's stomach at the sight of official documents. Bradley explained that the bank had reviewed Jake's situation and, despite some recent improvements in his record-keeping, had decided to accelerate the foreclosure timeline due to concerns about winter feed costs and livestock mortality rates. Sarah Beth listened with growing tension, her business education allowing her to understand the implications even better than Jake, who felt his world tilting toward the familiar abyss of loss and failure. The papers gave them 2 weeks instead of the promised 30 days, a crushing blow that made their recent progress seem insignificant against the machinery of institutional power. After Bradley departed, Sarah Beth paced the kitchen with agitated energy, while Jake sat in stunned silence. The foreclosure notice spread before him like a death certificate for his family's legacy. She spoke rapidly about options and strategies, her mind racing through possibilities with the analytical precision of her banking background. But even her educated optimism couldn't disguise the mathematical brutality of their situation. They needed $1,800 in 14 days, and even her most creative financial projections couldn't generate that kind of money from ranch operations or livestock sales in such a short time frame. Jake watched her pace and gesture, marveling at her refusal to surrender even when faced with apparently insurmountable odds, and feeling something like love mixed with his desperate gratitude for her partnership. The afternoon light streaming through the window seemed to illuminate not just their immediate crisis, but the growing strength of their bond in the face of shared adversity. That evening, Sarah Beth sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper, writing what appeared to be a letter with intense concentration while Jake tended to the evening chores with unusual slowness, dreading the conversation they would need to have about their impossible situation. When he finally came inside, she looked up from her writing with an expression of determination mixed with something that might have been fear or hope. "I'm writing to my father's attorney in Denver," she said simply, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized she was considering returning to her old life, sacrificing their newfound partnership to save his ranch through connections she had fled. The thought of losing her felt almost worse than losing the land, and he struggled to find words that would express his growing dependence on her presence without seeming to trap her in his desperate circumstances. Sarah Beth saw the pain in Jake's face and quickly explained that she wasn't planning to return to Denver, but rather to claim an inheritance from her grandmother that she had never bothered to access while living comfortably in her father's house. The inheritance, she explained, was substantial enough to pay off the ranch debt and provide capital for improvements, but claiming it would require revealing her location and current circumstances to her family. Jake listened with growing amazement and concern, understanding that using this inheritance would burn Sarah Beth's bridges with her old life as completely as his $2 bid had burned his bridges with solitary independence. They sat across from each other in the lamplight, both recognizing that they stood at a crossroads, where their individual desperation would either bind them together permanently or destroy the fragile trust they had been building. The letter lay between them like a contract with fate, waiting for their mutual agreement to change everything. The next morning, Jake found Sarah Beth in the barn at dawn, brushing down his favorite mare with careful strokes while talking to the animal in the soft tones she reserved for moments when she thought no one was listening. He watched from the doorway as she worked, noting how naturally she had adapted to ranch rhythms and how the animals responded to her patient presence. When she noticed him, she smiled with the particular warmth that had become familiar over their weeks together. And Jake realized with startling clarity that somewhere between the bride auction and this moment, he had fallen completely in love with this remarkable woman. The realization struck him with both joy and terror, because loving Sarah Beth meant accepting that losing her would hurt far more than losing the ranch ever could. He approached her slowly, searching for words to express feelings that seemed too large and precious for ordinary conversation. "Sarah Beth," Jake began, his voice rough with emotion and morning cold, "before you send that letter, I need you to know something." She continued brushing the mare but turned her attention fully to him, her brown eyes reflecting the early sunlight filtering through the barn walls. He spoke about his growing feelings with the careful honesty of a man unaccustomed to revealing his heart, telling her that her presence had transformed not just his ranch's prospects but his entire understanding of what home could mean. She listened without interruption, her hands never pausing in their gentle work, until he finally managed to say the words that had been building in his chest for weeks. "I love you. And not because you can save my ranch, but because you chose to stay when you could have chosen anything." The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility, while dust motes danced in the morning light like tiny celebrations of honesty finally spoken aloud. Sarah Beth's response was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at dangerous speed, and Jake stepped outside to see a group of men riding hard toward the ranch house with the urgency that spelled serious trouble. Sarah Beth joined him on the porch as the riders drew closer, and Jake recognized the leader as Samuel Pierce, a powerful rancher from the eastern part of the county, known for his aggressive business practices and political connections. Pierce dismounted with theatrical authority, his expensive clothes and confident bearing marking him as a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation or purchase. Behind him rode 3 other men, including what appeared to be a Denver banker in city clothes who seemed remarkably interested in Sarah Beth's presence on the porch. Jake felt danger crackling in the air, like electricity before a storm, and Sarah Beth's sudden stillness beside him confirmed that their brief respite from crisis was about to end in ways they hadn't anticipated. Pierce wasted no time on pleasantries, announcing that he represented certain Denver interests who had learned of Sarah Beth's current location and were prepared to offer Jake substantial compensation for releasing his claim on a woman who belonged elsewhere. The banker stepped forward and identified himself as Harrison Wells, Sarah Beth's father's business partner, explaining that her disappearance had caused considerable concern, and that her family was prepared to pay handsomely for her safe return. Sarah Beth stood frozen beside Jake, her face pale but resolute, as Wells continued speaking about her father's worry, her intended husband's forgiveness, and the generous settlement that awaited her compliance. Jake felt rage building in his chest as he realized these men viewed Sarah Beth as property to be negotiated over, but he forced himself to remain calm while watching her face for any sign of her feelings about their ultimatum. The morning air seemed to grow colder as the implications of this confrontation settled over all of them like gathering storm clouds. "Gentlemen," Sarah Beth said, her voice carrying the steel of her banker father's training as she stepped forward to face her pursuers directly, "I appreciate your concern, but I am exactly where I choose to be." Wells argued about her responsibilities to family and society, while Pierce made increasingly aggressive suggestions about the consequences of defying powerful Denver interests. But Sarah Beth remained unmoved by their pressure. She spoke about her legal right to make her own choices as an adult woman, her legitimate marriage to Jake, and her intention to remain at the ranch regardless of any financial inducements or threats they might offer. Jake watched with growing admiration as his wife demonstrated the courage and intelligence that had drawn him to her, but he also noted the subtle signs of strain in her posture that revealed the emotional cost of this confrontation. The standoff stretched taut between them all, heavy with the weight of old obligations clashing against new loyalties. Pierce's patience finally snapped, and he began making explicit threats about what would happen to Jake's ranch if he continued to harbor a runaway woman who belonged to more powerful men than himself. Jake stepped protectively closer to Sarah Beth, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he kept by the door, while Pierce detailed his connections to the same bank that held Jake's mortgage and his ability to ensure that foreclosure proceedings moved even faster than currently scheduled. Wells added his own pressure by describing Sarah Beth's father's heartbreak and the financial ruin that might befall Jake's innocent neighbors if certain agricultural loans were called in early. The men seemed to feed off each other's aggression, their voices growing louder and more threatening as they realized that neither Jake nor Sarah Beth would be easily intimidated by their combination of wealth, influence, and veiled violence. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge between negotiation and something much more dangerous. In the growing tension, Sarah Beth made a decision that surprised everyone present by announcing calmly that she would need to see certain legal documents before discussing any resolution to their situation. She spoke with the professional authority of someone well-versed in business negotiations, requesting proof of her father's claims about her inheritance, documentation of Pierce's relationship to the Denver banking interests, and clarification of the legal standing of marriages performed at county fairs. Wells fumbled for papers in his satchel while Pierce grew visibly frustrated with what he clearly viewed as stalling tactics, but Sarah Beth continued questioning their authority with systematic precision. Jake watched with growing amazement as his wife demonstrated skills he hadn't fully appreciated, turning the men's aggressive certainty into defensive explanations of their positions. The morning sun climbed higher as the conversation shifted from threats to legal technicalities, and Jake began to sense that Sarah Beth had some plan that none of them could yet see. As Wells spread documents across the porch railing, Sarah Beth examined them with professional competence while revealing information that stunned everyone present, including Jake. She explained that her grandmother's inheritance included not just money, but shares in several Denver banks, including the one that currently held Jake's mortgage, making her a significant stakeholder in the very institution that threatened their ranch. Furthermore, she had been studying territorial law during her weeks at the ranch and was confident that her marriage to Jake was completely legal and binding, regardless of the circumstances of their meeting. Pierce's confident aggression began to crumble as Sarah Beth demonstrated knowledge and authority that matched his own. While Wells looked increasingly uncomfortable with the legal and financial complexities that his simple retrieval mission had revealed, Jake felt a surge of pride and amazement at his wife's strategic brilliance, but also a growing awareness that the woman he loved possessed resources and capabilities that reached far beyond anything he had imagined. The revelation of Sarah Beth's inheritance and banking connections transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. As Pierce realized he was dealing with someone who wielded considerable financial power rather than a helpless runaway woman, Wells began backpedaling frantically, explaining that Sarah Beth's father had never intended to pressure her if she truly wanted to remain in Montana, and that the inheritance could certainly be arranged without requiring her return to Denver. Pierce, meanwhile, calculated quickly and began speaking in more respectful tones about potential business partnerships and mutual benefits rather than threats and intimidation. Sarah Beth listened to their revised approaches with polite skepticism, clearly understanding that their change in attitude reflected respect for her money rather than acceptance of her choices. Jake watched this transformation with fascination and some concern, realizing that his wife's true capabilities made him wonder what other surprises their partnership might reveal. As the morning progressed into a complex financial negotiation, Jake found himself largely excluded from conversations that moved far beyond his understanding of banking, inheritance law, and business partnerships. Sarah Beth spoke with Wells and Pierce about trust funds, stock transfers, and mortgage restructuring with the fluent confidence of someone who had been raised in that world. While Jake stood by feeling increasingly out of place in his own crisis, he watched his wife transform before his eyes from the refugee he had married into a powerful woman conducting business with men who had arrived intending to intimidate her, and he struggled with mixed feelings of pride, admiration, and uncertainty about where he fit into this new version of their story. The ranch, that had been his entire world, suddenly seemed very small compared to the financial empire that Sarah Beth apparently commanded. And Jake wondered if love alone would be enough to bridge such vastly different backgrounds and expectations. By noon, Sarah Beth had negotiated not only the immediate payment of Jake's ranch mortgage, but also secured favorable lending terms for ranch improvements and livestock expansion that would position them for long-term success. Wells and Pierce departed with signed agreements that gave Sarah Beth control of her inheritance while establishing business relationships that would benefit everyone involved, including Jake's previously threatened neighbors whose loans would now be restructured under more favorable terms. Jake stood on his porch watching the men ride away, feeling stunned by the morning's revelations and uncertain about what Sarah Beth's demonstration of power meant for their personal relationship. She joined him on the porch, looking suddenly vulnerable despite her morning's triumph, and Jake realized that she was as unsure as he was about how their marriage would survive the revelation of such dramatically unequal resources and capabilities. That evening, Jake and Sarah Beth sat in their kitchen surrounded by the legal documents and financial papers that had secured their ranch but also revealed the vast gulf between their backgrounds and resources. The silence stretched uncomfortably between them as both struggled with the implications of the day's discoveries, Jake feeling inadequate and uncertain about his role in a partnership where his wife wielded such disproportionate power, while Sarah Beth feared that her wealth would destroy the authentic connection they had been building based on mutual need and growing affection. Finally, Sarah Beth spoke about her fear that Jake would see her differently now that he knew about her inheritance, that he would feel like a kept man rather than an equal partner in their shared life. Jake listened to her vulnerability with growing understanding, realizing that wealth could be as much a barrier to genuine love as poverty, and that Sarah Beth's flight from Denver had been motivated by the same desire for authentic partnership that had driven him to gamble his last $2 on a veiled stranger. In the lamplight, they began the difficult conversation about how to build a marriage that honored both their individual strengths and their mutual need for equality and respect. winter settled over the Morrison Ranch with unusual gentleness, as if nature itself approved of the changes that had transformed the struggling homestead into a thriving operation. Jake and Sarah Beth had spent the weeks following the confrontation with Pierce and Wells, working through the complex emotions and practical adjustments that came with their new financial security and deeper understanding of each other's backgrounds. They established new routines that honored both Jake's expertise with ranch operations and Sarah Beth's business acumen, creating a true partnership where decisions were made jointly and responsibilities shared according to ability rather than traditional gender roles. The house felt warmer and more alive than it had since Jake's father's death, filled with the sounds of planning, laughter, and the quiet intimacy of two people learning to trust each other completely. Snow covered the fields like a blessing, while inside, Jake and Sarah Beth discovered that love could indeed bridge any gap when both people were willing to meet in the middle. The true test of their partnership came when Sarah Beth received a letter from her father, written in his own hand rather than dictated to a secretary, expressing his regret for the way he had handled her desire for independence, and his hope that she had found the happiness that had always seemed to elude her in Denver society. He wrote about his pride in her business accomplishments at the ranch, which Wells had described in detail, and his desire to meet the man who had earned his daughter's loyalty and love. Jake read the letter over Sarah Beth's shoulder, feeling her tension as she struggled between her old hurt and her natural affection for the man who had raised her with both love and impossible expectations. The invitation for them to visit Denver during the spring represented not just reconciliation with her family, but the final integration of Sarah Beth's two worlds, the privileged past she had fled, and the authentic future she was building with Jake. Winter evenings were spent discussing this possibility with careful attention to both hope and caution. As spring approached, Jake and Sarah Beth made the decision to visit Denver, but on their own terms and as equal partners representing the success of their ranch and marriage. They traveled in comfort that Jake's old circumstances could never have afforded, but Sarah Beth was careful to ensure that their trip demonstrated their mutual prosperity rather than her individual wealth. In Denver, Jake met Sarah Beth's father and was surprised to find a man who, despite his mistakes in handling his daughter's desires for independence, genuinely cared about her happiness and was prepared to welcome Jake as the partner she had chosen. The visit revealed to Jake that Sarah Beth's flight had been motivated not by hatred of her family, but by her need to discover who she could become when her intelligence and capabilities were valued for themselves, rather than as tools to advance someone else's ambitions. Her father's evident respect for what they had accomplished together validated their partnership in ways that neither had expected, while Jake's natural dignity and obvious devotion to Sarah Beth won him acceptance as an equal rather than a charity case. The climax of their Denver visit came during a dinner party where Sarah Beth's former intended husband, Robert Carrington, made an appearance clearly designed to test the strength of her commitment to her new life. Carrington spoke condescendingly about ranch life and made subtle suggestions about Sarah Beth's eventual return to civilized society, while Jake struggled with the social dynamics of a world where his straightforward honesty seemed out of place. Among practiced conversational games, Sarah Beth watched the interaction with growing anger, not at Jake's discomfort with Denver society, but at Carrington's arrogant assumption that her current happiness was temporary. When Carrington finally made an explicit suggestion that Sarah Beth's ranch adventure would naturally end once she tired of playing house in the wilderness, she responded with icy precision about the success of their operations, the satisfaction of building something meaningful, and her complete contentment with a man who valued her mind, her contributions, and her independence. Her defense of their life together silenced Carrington and demonstrated to everyone present that Sarah Beth had indeed found what she had been seeking when she fled Denver. The confrontation with Carrington crystallized everything Jake and Sarah Beth had been building together, as she made it clear to her father's entire social circle that her marriage represented not a desperate escape, but a purposeful choice of authentic partnership over social convenience. Jake found his voice in that elegant dining room, speaking with quiet authority about their ranch, their plans for expansion, and his deep respect for the woman who had transformed not just his financial prospects, but his entire understanding of what marriage could be when two people brought their individual strengths to shared dreams. Sarah Beth watched him hold his own among men who had initially dismissed him as beneath their notice, and felt her love deepen into the kind of permanent commitment that transcends circumstances and social expectations. by the evening's end. Even Carrington seemed to understand that Sarah Beth had made an irrevocable choice based on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than temporary rebellion against her father's authority. The entire Denver social circle witnessed the strength of a partnership that had grown from desperate gamble to unshakable foundation. Their return to Montana felt like coming home in the deepest sense, as Jake and Sarah Beth appreciated their ranch and their life together with new eyes after seeing it reflected in the surprised respect of Denver society. They had proven to themselves and others that their unlikely beginning had produced something rare and valuably marriage-based, on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and complementary strengths that made them more effective together than either could be alone. The spring work began with renewed energy and expanded plans that reflected their combined resources and shared vision for the ranch's future. Jake worked with new confidence in his role as Sarah Beth's equal partner, while she applied her business skills with the satisfaction of knowing they served a shared dream rather than someone else's ambitions. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming known throughout the territory as a model of successful agricultural innovation and evidence that unconventional partnerships could produce extraordinary results. Summer brought the first anniversary of their meeting at the Cedar Creek County Fair, and Jake and Sarah Beth celebrated by hosting a community gathering that brought together all their neighbors for a day of food, music, and shared stories about the challenges and rewards of frontier life. Jake watched his wife move easily among people who had initially been curious about the refined woman who had married their struggling neighbor, and saw how completely she had been accepted as part of their community based on her contributions and character rather than her background or resources. Sarah Beth watched Jake joke with neighbors and organize games for the children, and marveled at how far they had both traveled from the desperate people who had gambled everything on each other 12 months earlier. The celebration felt like both an anniversary and a beginning, marking not just their survival of crisis but their transformation into a couple whose love had deepened through shared challenges and mutual discovery. As the evening wound down and neighbors departed with thanks for a wonderful day, Jake and Sarah Beth sat on their porch in comfortable silence, listening to the familiar sounds of their ranch settling into peaceful night rhythms. As autumn returned to the Montana mountains, Jake and Sarah Beth stood together in the same spot where he had first read the foreclosure notice that had driven him to desperate measures exactly 1 year earlier. The ranch spread before them in the golden light of harvest season, transformed from a struggling operation into a thriving enterprise that employed several ranch hands and served as a model for other agricultural operations in the territory. They had built something substantial together, not just a successful business, but a partnership that had proved stronger than their individual limitations and more fulfilling than either had imagined possible when they first shook hands after that unlikely auction. Sarah Beth leaned against Jake's shoulder as they watched their cattle graze in fields that were now permanently theirs, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from building something meaningful through shared effort and unwavering mutual support. The autumn air carried the scent of success and the promise of winters that would never again threaten their security or their togetherness. Winter brought unexpected news in the form of a letter from Jake's sister Margaret, who had moved to California years earlier and lost touch during his father's illness and death. She wrote about her own family's struggles and her regret at missing their father's funeral, but also about her joy at hearing through mutual acquaintances about Jake's marriage and the ranch's remarkable recovery. Margaret's letter included an invitation for Jake and Sarah Beth to visit California, and her hope that she might return to Montana for the holidays to meet the woman who had saved both her brother and their family's legacy. Sarah Beth watched. Jake read the letter with tears in his eyes, understanding that her arrival in his life had not only secured his future but also restored connections he had thought permanently lost. They spent the evening planning for Margaret's visit and discussing how their partnership had created ripple effects of healing and connection that reached far beyond their own relationship, bringing hope and renewed possibility to everyone whose life had been touched by their unlikely love story. Christmas Eve found the Morrison Ranch filled with the warmth of celebration and the joy of family reunited, as Margaret arrived with her children to find her childhood home transformed by prosperity, love, and her brother's obvious happiness. She embraced Sarah Beth with genuine affection, expressing gratitude not just for saving the ranch but for bringing light back into Jake's eyes and purpose back into his life. The house sparkled with decorations that Sarah Beth had made with Martha's help, while Jake carved the turkey he had raised himself on land that was now secure for future generations. As they gathered around the dinner table, Jake offered a prayer of thanksgiving that acknowledged not just their material blessings, but the miracle of two desperate people finding salvation in each other's courage and love. The candlelight illuminated faces filled with contentment and hope, while outside the snow fell gently on fields that represented home, security, and the permanent triumph of faith over fear. On New Year's Eve, Jake and Sarah Beth stood together on their front porch, looking out over the ranch that had become the foundation for a life neither had dared to imagine. When they first met at that county fair auction, Jake reflected aloud about the chain of events that had brought them together: his desperation, her courage, and the mysterious workings of Providence that had guided two lost souls toward each other across the vast distances of chance and choice. Sarah Beth spoke about her gratitude for Jake's willingness to see beyond her veil to the person she truly was, and his acceptance of all her complexities and capabilities without trying to diminish or control them. As midnight approached, they kissed under the Montana stars, surrounded by the sounds of their prosperous ranch, and the knowledge that they had built something lasting through the alchemy of mutual respect, shared courage, and love that had grown stronger through every test. The new year stretched before them, full of promise, while behind them lay the transformed landscape of two lives, joined in partnership that had proved love could indeed conquer every obstacle when both hearts were brave enough to trust in the possibility of finding home in each other.